evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ruth Zacharin, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And I want to welcome you to our second town hall. Tonight, we are going to be exploring how the recent uptick in gun sales may impact safety for survivors of domestic violence. And before we get started with our content, I just want to tell you a little bit about what you can expect from tonight's program. I'm going to be talking about some general information about the coalition, as well as the intersection of domestic violence and guns. And then I'll be turning it over to our main speaker of this evening, Suzanne Dubu. We're very excited to have her with us. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her and her work later on in the program. We're going to have some action steps at the end of that, and then have a moderated question and answer that Emily Popke from the coalition will help facilitate. And at the end, we're going to give you some information about what you can expect from upcoming webinars, including two that we're in the process of planning now, one with some researchers from the Boston University School of Public Health, and one with member organizations who are doing community-based work to respond to communities most impacted by both gun violence and the pandemic. Just a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started. Wanted to let folks know that we are recording the webinar this evening. For those of you who joined us last week for our town hall about suicide and firearms, we did record that one as well. We are working to figure out the technology of editing it to get it to a shorter version so we can send it out to you. But once we figure out that technology, you will have access to it. And during this program, we won't be taking questions and answers as we go through our material, but please feel free to use the chat as you're thinking of questions, because we'll be collecting that information at the end for the moderated Q&A. And also, before we get started, I wanted to welcome a couple of people. We are being joined tonight by Representative David Linsky, who has long been a champion of gun violence prevention and related legislation, as well as Nicole Stevens, who is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Caucus of Women Legislators. I wanted to welcome both of you to tonight's program. Just a little bit about the coalition before we get started in our content tonight. Many of you are familiar with us, but the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence was founded in 2013 in the immediate aftermath of the massacre that happened at Sandy Hook, with the goal of strengthening legislation in Massachusetts that would prevent such a thing from happening here. And while we started with a very small group of mostly faith-based organizations, since then we have grown to almost 100 member organizations from around the Commonwealth, as well as some of our national partners. And our scope has several different aspects. We engage in lots of different kinds of work to address gun violence in all its forms. Legislative advocacy, as I mentioned before, strengthening laws that protect us from gun violence. Supporting primary prevention, which means supporting the work of our member organizations, raising awareness about what they do, as well as budget advocacy to make sure that prevention programming has as robust funding as possible. Public awareness and education, as well as community organizing and mobilization to bring folks together who want to make change, to address the issue of gun violence and help them figure out how they can move the needle to make our world safer from guns. So now I want to pivot to talking specifically about domestic violence and guns. And first I want to say I'm really thrilled that we're having this program tonight. This is an issue that is incredibly important to me and very near and dear to my heart. For those of you who are not familiar with my background, prior to coming to the coalition, I worked with survivors of domestic and sexual violence for over 20 years. And what brought me to the work of gun violence was seeing the impact of guns on survivors of domestic violence and on their children, and really wanting to change the narrative around that, and knowing that guns play such a role in safety planning for survivors, and having actually lost a client to gun violence myself and worked with many children who had lost a parent to a domestic violence homicide, that's what really brought me to the work of gun violence prevention. So I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation tonight. I'm going to be sharing with you some statistics about domestic violence and firearms. And one of the things that I wanted to say before I do that is, for me, when I talk about these statistics and these numbers, what I picture in my mind's eye are the faces of the survivors that I have worked with. And what I carry in my heart is their stories. So every time I tell you about one of these statistics, it's very meaningful for me because I know someone or many someones who've been affected by these very issues. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on stats, but I do want to give you a sense of the scope of this issue. A couple of things that we wanted to share. One is that in an average month, at least 53 women in the United States are shot and killed by a current or former intimate partner. That is really a huge number. In addition to that, nearly 1 million women alive in the United States today have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. And I do want to point out that domestic violence affects men as well, affects folks of all gender identities. But when we're talking about these issues, this is something that primarily impacts women. And beyond injuries, beyond deaths related to guns and domestic violence, I think it's also important that we ground ourselves in the following issue. Domestic violence is about power and control. Suzanne is going to talk in much greater detail about that. And guns are ever present in the work with survivors of domestic violence. So even if someone is never actually harmed by a gun, guns are so often used to control or coerce. About 4.5 million women in the United States alive today report being threatened with a gun by an intimate partner. And that can be anything from having a gun waved in front of them, or in the case of someone that I worked with, her partner used to take out the gun every night before they would go to bed and clean it as a way of showing her exactly what power he had in his hands with this weapon. And it's also important that we remember when we think about this, that in so many of these situations, children are also in homes where these things are happening, and they are seeing the control, the coercion that's happening with guns, and they're also witnessing the incidents of violence. Just a little bit about domestic violence and mass shootings. Suzanne is going to talk about this more later. One of the things that I didn't realize prior to coming to the coalition is how closely related domestic violence and mass shootings are. Everytown for Gun Safety's analysis of mass shootings includes shootings anytime where 4 or more people are shot and killed. And when we use that definition, in at least 54% of these incidents, the perpetrator shot a current or former intimate partner or family member. So in 54% of mass shootings, there's some connection to domestic violence. And just recently in the news, we're hearing that the mass shooting that occurred in Nova Scotia this past week, which was horrible, started as a domestic violence incident. And I think it's really important that we think about how we define and talk about these issues. And one example I use is just a few months ago in Abington, Massachusetts, not too far from where I'm sitting right now, there was an incident where a man killed himself, his wife, and their 3 children. And if we use Everytown's definition of a mass shooting, where that means that 4 or more people were shot and killed, this does count as a mass shooting. But it's also a domestic violence homicide, and it's also a murder-suicide. And I bring that up because these are the kinds of things that make it very difficult when we think about how to define these issues and how to talk about them. They're not always so clear-cut, and some of these things are really intertwined in very profound ways. I also just want to touch very quickly on gender-based violence, misogyny, and guns. There was a mass shooting that happened a few years ago in California where someone shot and killed himself, but he also, before he did that, killed 6 other people. Some were shot and some were stabbed and wounded an additional 14. In the aftermath of that, a document was found that outlined his hatred of women, his frustration about not having a girlfriend, his contempt for couples, and his plans for retribution. And this was someone to be found as a member of the incel movement. And so that mass shooting was very tied to gender-based violence and misogyny. So somewhat related to domestic violence, but another way that we need to think about mass shootings and what the root causes of the shooting that's happened. Domestic violence, guns, and racial disparity, it's incredibly important when we have these conversations that we remember that women of color are disproportionately affected by these issues and that they're victimized at significantly higher rates. Compared to white women, Black women are twice as likely to be fatally shot by an intimate partner. In the age group of 18 to 34, women of color are nearly 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner than are white women in the same age group. The reason why we started having these town halls is because we were so concerned about the uptick of gun sales as a response to the pandemic. And there are many issues to talk about with that. Specific to domestic violence, we do know that more guns means more risk. And there's a study that came out of the University of Indianapolis just recently that really quantified that and showed that for each 10% increase in household gun ownership rates, there is a 13% increase in domestic firearm homicide. And that states with the highest firearm ownership had a 65% higher rate of domestic firearm homicide compared to states with a lower ownership rate. And that this is actually different than other kinds of homicide. And I think there's probably some more to unpack from this. But this particular study found that the rates of other kinds of gun homicides, such as those involving friends, acquaintances, and strangers, did not rise in the same way. So this is something that we really need to be thinking about when it comes to risk around domestic violence. So now I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to be turning it over to Suzanne Dubu, and I want to tell you a little bit more about her and her background before she starts to speak. And we're really thrilled to have you join us this evening, Suzanne, not just because of your incredible experience, but because for me personally, you've been a friend and colleague for quite a while, and I'm really excited to have you be a part of this conversation with us. So Suzanne Dubu joined the Jeanne Geiger Crisis Center in 1995 and has served as its chief executive since 1997. She is credited with developing and administering domestic violence programs that are informed by the needs of survivors and are comprehensive and effective. A survivor of domestic violence, she understands what it means to be in an abusive relationship and how challenging it is to leave. She believes that safety should not be simply placed on the survivor's shoulders, but that the responsibility for establishing a safe community belongs to the community itself. That perspective, combined with her vision and the hard work of her staff, volunteers, and the board of directors, has transformed the work of the Jeanne Geiger Crisis Center. Recognized as an expert in the field, Suzanne was named a champion of change by the White House in October 2011. She was invited to attend the first summit on the United State of Women, representing an important moment for women and girls domestically and internationally, as well as for all proponents of gender justice and equality. She currently serves as a member of the Massachusetts Governor's Council on Sexual and Domestic Violence, the Massachusetts Council on Family Serving Agencies, and is a past president of the board of Jane Doe, Inc., the statewide coalition of domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure, and it's certainly timely for us to be talking about these issues. Ruth, you've provided excellent background information on the intersection of guns and domestic violence, and you can switch the slide. But I want to talk a little bit about just kind of a reminder, we're setting some more context about this perfect storm that is brewing right now. I want to tell you about the domestic violence high-risk team model and share some of the strategies we use to reduce domestic violence homicide by focusing on guns. So I just want to do a quick little reminder. I know that the folks that belong to the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, there's so many different forms of gun violence, so I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea just to remind people that domestic violence affects 1 in 3 women. They will experience abuse during their lifetime, and that same stat for men is 1 in 7 men. And it takes many forms. It's emotional emotional abuse, it is financial abuse, it is about using children as the fodder to gain control in relationships. It is psychological abuse. We hear the term gaslighting a lot these days. But tonight we're really going to be talking about the most dangerous forms of abuse. And by that, I think all abuse is dangerous. I am a survivor, and there were lots of times I did not feel like my life was in someone else's hands, but I felt that my soul was. And I'm just making a distinction that physical violence, and particularly violence when it comes to guns, is the kind of domestic violence that we're going to be speaking about tonight. And the domestic violence is referring to abuse that's committed by an intimate partner. So this isn't necessarily about a child abusing a parent or a sibling. This is really intimate partners, whether they're currently in a relationship or have been in a relationship before. And as Ruth pointed out before, domestic violence affects people of all genders and sexual orientation, and the impact of abuse and severe violence is predominantly experienced by women with male partners. Next slide, please. So, you know what, Ruth? I think we have the wrong PowerPoint. But it's okay. I think we can skip through this slide. These are just really a repeat of the statistics that Ruth's already talked about. So this is actually where I want to start. So the numbers on the escalation in gun sales right now are mind-blowing. In March, nearly 4 million background checks were completed by the FBI. Experts began warning really when coronavirus hit Europe that there was going to be a likely spike in domestic violence during stay-at-home orders and as people took to their homes and began to isolate. And paired with a spike in calls to hotlines and surging gun sales, many fear the worst. One of the things that I think about this as an algebraic equation. I think about, increased guns in homes plus growing isolation and the difficulty that victims have to leaving their abusers during these times points to some really possible horrifying outcomes. So I thought I would also just tell you a little bit about what it's like to be inside the life of a domestic violence organization right now. Initially, right after we got the stay-at-home orders, advocates and our lawyers and counselors, we all began to work from home and try to figure out how to do that. But the first thing that we noticed was that there was a drop in hotline calls. And that is a very scary thing to happen because we know domestic violence didn't end yesterday. We know that things are still happening, but for whatever reason, people are either unable to pick up the phone or really are so distracted with the other things that they need to figure out in their lives. There's also an impression, I think, for survivors that when you start to hear that everything's closed down, that the courts are closed down, that services have gone, virtual, that there's a sense that there's nowhere to turn. And so I think one of the biggest challenges we've had of late is really just making sure that people know our office might be closed, but we are busy working. And then the third piece is when survivors are trapped at home with their abusers or are forced to co-parent in a different way because of coronavirus. And what we find is that, and what our fear is with that drop in hotline calls, is that the abuse is ramping up and there is less opportunity for survivors to reach out. Next slide, please. So as Ruth talked about earlier, so there is a connection between domestic violence killings, murder-suicides, and mass killings. And the thing that connects them, there are actually two things. One is that they all involve firearms. The second piece is that there is an ability to really analyze the behavior of the perpetrators or the abusers and understand that there were warning signs in place before these things happen. And so that's part of what I want to talk to you about later. So on average, there are 11 murder-suicides per week, and we know that roughly 65 to 70% of those are domestic violence. During the first week of April, there was a 100% increase in the number of murder-suicides. Now, it's a bit too early to predict that, this is the way it's going to happen. We don't know that. Hopefully that was a blip. And then Ruth also talked about mass killings, that 54% of those are really involve an intimate partner, and they begin with the killing. Oftentimes it is the family. Sometimes in about 10% of mass killings, they kill the intimate partner and anyone else who might be around, and then the violence spirals out into the community. Next slide, please. So one of the things, I don't know if there's a way that we can come back to this slide. And if there's not, okay. So sorry. All right, so this is, go ahead and go back to that. I'm going to tell a story and we're going to have to look at this slide. So when Ruth described that she had a client who was shot by her abuser, I don't know too many advocates for whom that's not true. And for us at the Crisis Center, this happened in 2002, and our client's name is Dorothy. And she came into the organization. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to look to see if I can find my slide because it's not here. It's all right. Dorothy came to our organization in February 2002. She had 2 daughters. She had been on the run. She lived in Amesbury, Massachusetts. She was terribly afraid of her husband. At the time, she was 36 years old. She had been with her husband since they were 15. There had been 20 years of abuse, but it was undocumented, meaning that they weren't, it was not documented by the police. She never called the police. She didn't go to the hospital. The one time she went to the hospital staff interviewed her with the husband standing right next to the bed. And so when asked, how did you get this injury? And she said she fell down the basement stairs. There was no question. There was no attempt to see if there was some other kind of information available. So she runs from shelter to shelter. She would go back home when things just seemed like there was no way out of this relationship. And in February, she was at a shelter in Maine. She had a restraining order that had been taken out in Massachusetts. When she went back to extend the restraining order, the judge in error said he didn't have jurisdiction and sent her back to the shelter. She finally gave up. They couldn't stay there. Her daughter was, one of her daughters was a senior in high school and really wanted to graduate with her class. Her other daughter was 11 years old, and they were both missing their friends and family. And at that point, she threw her hands up. She came back. She went to a Massachusetts court. She got the restraining order renewed, and she moved back home. The judge ordered her husband to leave the house, but said that he could still come back to the house to get his tools on a daily basis. He was a cable installer, and he would go every morning to the garage, get the tools, and go work, and then come back, return them, and leave. That was the plan. But almost on every occasion, there was some form of abuse, whether it was banging on the door or screaming at her through the door or trying to coax the girls out so that she would also come outside. There was just this continual, really breaking the restraining order over and over and over. So Dorothy went to the local district court. She was slated to really testify and get the restraining order extended for lifetime. And she reported all of his violations. The police were looking for him. we were busy trying to keep her safe and keep her daughters, get her daughters actually into services. And when he actually turned himself into court, the judge didn't have any of the information in front of him. It was the end of day. He released him on low cash bail. And 4 days later, her husband knocked on the door of the house. The 11-year-old daughter opened the door. He pushed his way past his daughter, said, "Go upstairs." And he went in, shot his wife, and then killed himself. What is tragic about that, there's so many things that are tragic. I do want to talk about what happened to those two girls later, because it's really important. We talk about that the victim in that case was Dorothy, but it was also those two girls, and they were left orphans. And it wasn't until that happened that I began to actually think about, yeah, they lost their mother, they lost their father, they lost their home, they lost everything that they knew about their lives. And it was because he had this gun that no one knew about. So, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. What we wanted to do after that happened, and I have to tell you, I was the executive director then. Everybody who I worked with was so busy trying to figure out what happened and what are we doing here? If we can't save those who are in the most harm, what are we doing here? And we were also, it was a terrible time in the community. The judge was upset, the DA was upset, there was a lot of finger pointing, a lot of people accusing each other of not doing their job. And so what that highlighted for us was we really tried to take the higher road here and tried to figure out, so if the next person with the same kind of danger in her life comes through our doors, what new option do we have? You know, at the time, the only thing that we thought we could do for victims who were at high risk of being killed or physically assaulted was to go to shelter. And if they didn't want to go to shelter, then people had this kind of collective shrug of their shoulders and said, then it must not be that bad. So what we figured out, though, was that there was a lack of communication. So this was in 2002. There were lots of perceived obstacles that the police couldn't work with the advocates and the advocates couldn't communicate to the courts. And so this protection of the client's right to confidentiality began to trump everything. And we began to question ourselves, wait, is that true? If a woman knows that she's in this kind of trouble, is there a way that we can all work together on these cases separately? The other thing was that we had to question our assumption that the best solution was shelter. Is that true? Not all women can go into shelter, and there is such a shortage of shelter beds all the time. 2 years later, one of my staff members went to a conference and heard Dr. Jacqueline Campbell from Johns Hopkins talk about her study on femicide. And her study identified the 19 risk factors that are present right before a woman is there's an attempted homicide or she's been killed. And the way she conducted the study was really brilliant in that she interviewed friends and family of people, of murder victims, and asked, what did you hear? What was she telling you? So that was one set of information. The other set of information came from women that should have died, but fortunately did not. Women who were shot or thrown out of a moving car, whatever. And so that study showed 19 risk factors. So we began, once we got that aha moment of, wait a minute, so there's actually a way to quantify what's happening in a dangerous household. That was an aha moment. And then the next thing was that the femicide study also identified that those 90 days after a victim is leaving her home, that is the most dangerous time for her. And so we went back to the community who still were left so raw after Dorothy's murder and said, listen, we want to try something. That we have this whole body of information on risk assessment. We have this time window of 90 days. what would it be like if we all come together, figure out how we can share information ethically and with victims' permission, and handle these cases differently rather than just assuming she's going to go into shelter. So that's what we did. In 2005, we started taking cases. I won't go through all of our learnings, but what I can tell you is that in the last 15 years, we've had 0 homicides. When you think about the 10 years before we formed that team, we'd had 8 homicides. So it's really important. It's also really hard to measure what's not happening. So we really only have before and after data. But we also have some other kinds of data too that we like to talk about. Besides the fact that there's no homicides, we know that 92% of the victims whose cases have been part of the high-risk team model have reported there's been no further reassault. We know that 72% of the abusers go into the criminal justice system. And so the reason I wanted to talk about the domestic violence high-risk team model, which I'm just going to call DVHRT because I get tired of saying it over and over, it's an important strategy to, I think, put at the center of this perfect storm that is brewing. So when you have these increased gun sales, you've got increased isolation of victims. What we're finding as the hotline calls have begun to pick up is that the abuse, they've been enduring more abuse for a longer period of time. And so that by the time victims are calling our hotline and calling the police, rather than saying on a scale of 1 to 10, the abuse being somewhere around 5, it's closer to 7 or 8. So it means that we are dealing with women who are in very stressful situations. There's a lot of crisis going on, and we're finding a lot more physical violence. So one of the things I wanted to talk about with the domestic violence high-risk team model is how we handle guns. And so when we think about going back to that idea about domestic violence, homicides, mass killings, and murder-suicides being connected. So it is because of firearms, and there are indicators of risk before the crimes happen. Usually it is a threat of violence. One of the slides that I had hoped to show you tonight was actually the risk assessment that we did on Dorothy's after she died. We didn't have this tool. All we had was our gut instinct. But when we got the risk assessment tool and actually went through her affidavit and checked off what was actually in place during the brief time that she was with us, a high-risk, extreme danger case is rated at 18 or more, and she was at 30. So for us, this became a valuable tool that, number one, we could train law enforcement, courts, probation, advocates, hospital workers on the science of risk assessment, how to incorporate that in the working with victims, and to move swiftly when information changes. So now I'm going to talk about this in relationship to guns. So the primary information source on a DVHRT is the victim. It is not the police report. It is not the some court proceeding or probation officer report. And why that matters is the victim tends to know better than anyone else about the abuser's access to guns or whether they own guns. One instance I remember is a woman, I think we'd seen the police report before, and it said that he had 1 gun. When we talked to her, she said, oh no, he only has 1 licensed gun. He's got 23 guns in the basement, and his dad is a gun dealer. So these are the kinds of details that we can get from victims and help inform the law enforcement response, help inform the court proceedings. And so that's one thing. That's why it's really important. The other reason it's really important is that while there are good, I should back up. We have 28 domestic violence high-risk team models in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Jeanne Geiger, we have also trained over 100 jurisdictions across the country. So I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly right now. So there are some really good, strong gun laws in place. However, each state makes its own decision about how much they're going to enforce those. I can tell you that when some of my staff went to Montana to talk to them about a high-risk team, it was our first experience of really being in a gun-toting state, in that not even the victims wanted to let go of their guns, that they felt that this was the only thing that was keeping them safe. And we all know that it actually increases their risk of being killed to have a gun in their home, no matter whose it is. But what's different is when you can go to a courtroom or a chief of police and say, listen, I get it. You want to keep your guns, you're hunting, you're doing this, you're doing whatever. But can we just point out to you, here's the risk assessment that we've done on this case. Here's the information we've gathered. We can tell you that it is very likely that this person's going to kill their intimate partner, possibly, other people as well. They treat that a little bit differently. So even in jurisdictions that love their guns, sometimes in a high-risk case, they'll treat it differently. So it's another important reason to have that coordination of information that a DVHRT gathers presented to people that can actually make the difference. The other thing is there's also gaps in knowledge of in really important places. And so the DVHRT, we do three things. We are increasing victims' safety. We are holding abusers accountable for the context, for the history of domestic violence, not just this one incident. That gives us a much clearer picture about the likelihood of a progression to a lethal incident. And the third thing that we do is we audit the system. So the high-risk team, by working together, can identify some gap that exists that allows abusers to continue to abuse. One example that is related to guns is a judge orders the guns to be taken away, and the restraining order is granted, seize the guns, but there's actually no piece of paper that goes from his order, his stamping that order, to law enforcement to say, okay, here you go, here's your permission to go seize those guns. And so unless the victim thinks to mention it to law enforcement, it's not happening. So when that happened in one of the jurisdictions that we were helping, we helped them work with their legislature to close that gap. So that's another really important reason I think that DVHRTs need to be at the center of these gun conversations. The other thing is that we are typically working with the most dangerous offenders, and we are focused on the most dangerous risk factors. And gun ownership and access to weapons are two of the scariest risk factors. So why that matters is that every single group on this multidisciplinary team, whether they're domestic violence advocates, court personnel, the probation, the courts, DA's office, hospitals, every single group is asking, do they have guns? Do they have access to guns? They're looking at old police records. They're looking at old criminal reports. We're able to put together a much fuller picture about what's really happening in that household. And I do have a last word on the function of the DVHRTs about the auditing the system. I want to give you another example of when a gap appeared. Is we had worked with a woman. It was a very lethal, potentially lethal offender. He actually went away for 2 years for domestic violence. And because corrections also sits on our local team, they informed us that he was getting out, that he was going to be going to probation, that they were going to put a GPS bracelet on him, that they had seized the weapons, that everything was coordinated, and she shouldn't worry, that she should feel perfectly safe. So he was getting out of jail on a Friday. This was a long weekend. On Tuesday, he was supposed to show up at probation to get the GPS bracelet on so they could monitor his whereabouts and make sure that he was nowhere near his wife. And he didn't show. And they called him and he didn't answer the phone. And meanwhile, his wife is calling saying, I don't know where he is. It's freaking me out. I'm really scared. I stayed in a hotel all weekend. His brother has guns and I'm just really, really scared. So what had happened was the jail let him out on Friday as scheduled. Probation was closed for the weekend and he was supposed to just bring himself there magically on Tuesday morning. And so we identified that as really a really potentially lethal time. We know these guys are getting out. Many of them are very angry and feel that this is her responsibility and she was at fault. She is the one that led him to his jail time. So what we did was we worked with our own legislators and got that loophole closed so that now the jail brings them directly to probation and stands there while they get the bracelet on. It's not rocket science, but these are the kinds of gaps that exist everywhere that allow abusers to seemingly escape with very little punishment or accountability. And this is another reason why I think DVHRTs are particularly critical when we're talking about guns. So I know that we have some action items that Ruth wanted to talk about. Oh, this is it. Yeah, never mind, I already said that.
Are you all set with that, Suzanne?
Yes, sorry.
Well, thank you so much for all that information, Suzanne. We're going to be able to hear more from her during the question and answer period. But I think it's really so helpful to hear about this model that has been so effective in identifying risk and hopefully preventing future homicides. As we're thinking about this really concerning trend we're seeing with the uptick of gun sales and what that means for survivor safety, I think it gives hope to know that there's this model that you have been using to great effect for survivor safety. So thank you for all of that, Suzanne.
Thank you.
And as always, we wanted to give participants an opportunity to take some action. And just this week, there have been some dynamics happening that we really wanted to make sure folks were aware of. People are likely aware of the fact that over the past several weeks, there's been a lot of back and forth about gun stores being essential businesses and what that looks like across the country, including here in Massachusetts. And we've had some actions in the past several weeks that have addressed that. More recently, we have another concern in that goal, the Gun Owners Action League, which is the Massachusetts arm of the NRA, has been asking their members to write to Governor Baker and demand that he not only open gun stores and shooting ranges, but that he also resume the new gun license application process. In other words, have chiefs process applications for new gun licenses and have required gun training courses resume. This is very concerning for us. Opening the gun stores would be bad enough. It would mean that existing license holders could buy more guns, which seems far from essential, but allowing new applications to happen feels incredibly dangerous. Introduce a gun into a situation for the first time in the midst of a pandemic. This is the very last thing that we need at a time when people are already feeling a great deal of stress, on edge, and living on top of each other and isolated from their support networks. To have someone bring a gun into the home for the first time. This is dangerous for everyone, but particularly relates to our conversation this evening for those who are dealing with domestic violence in their homes, who are forced to shelter in place with their abusers, may not be able to go to work or go to school or access their supports, we don't want to bring guns into those situations for the first time. So what we're asking all of you is to really keep up the awareness around these issues and to keep up your social media posts, your emails to Governor Baker, thanking him for keeping gun stores closed, encouraging him to continue to do so during the pandemic. We need to be pushing back on Goal's efforts to open gun stores and to resume the new license application process and give the message that we do not need more guns in our homes and communities during the pandemic. We don't need more gun owners. We do not need first-time gun owners during this time of great stress. So if you can help us keep up the pressure and the awareness about this, we would greatly appreciate it. We included just a couple of hashtags to use with social media posts, one being "guns do not make us safer," and the other being "disarm DV." We really want to keep this grounded in survivor safety and making sure that everybody has a home where they feel safe. So now I'm going to ask Emily Popke to lead us through our question and answer period.
Hi, everybody. So our first question is, has the original DV-HRT model been revised at all since its inception based on current trends and methods of abuse?
Yes and no. So the model itself, I mean, you know, we used to say it has to be 80% prescriptive and 20% it had to be adapted to whatever community we were implementing in. However, over the last 15 years, we have learned so much, primarily from the communities where we've worked. You know, we knew our own community. Not every community is the same. So some of the things that have changed and shifted over time is who's part of a high-risk team. Depending on the makeup of the community, it's really important to make sure that that high-risk team is actually reaching the community, embedded in the community, and is trusted by the community. So, you know, that there are lots of communities everywhere where law enforcement is not going to be the trusted partner, where the domestic violence organization could be seen as a mainstream organization rather than one that is particularly relevant for culturally specific communities. So we really had to do a lot of work, I think, internally understanding that, but in communities to understand that this is the magic that makes it happen. So you better get that really right. The other piece that we have changed is really how we involve other community-based organizations to help really scan their environment. We know that only 20% of domestic violence survivors or victims will ever tell anyone that can actually do something about their situation. And so that means there are a lot of folks in the community that know things that are happening that the police don't know about, that we don't know about. So we've also done some work to figure out how do we include those folks in this reporting.
Great, thank you. Our next question, I think this is probably a question geared for Ruth. On our action slide, we mentioned a new license application process. What is this new process? How can new applicants get any training when shooting ranges are closed?
So it's not a new, the application process isn't new, it's an application process for potentially new gun owners. And so Goal is really pushing back to open up everything related to firearms. I do believe that there's a process that happens online as well, but really Goal is pushing for every aspect of the firearms industry to reopen as an essential business right now.
All right, we have another question. What is currently the biggest obstacle to your work in Massachusetts in general and as it relates to guns?
I guess we could probably both do that. Biggest obstacle. God, I have to think about that for a second.
You know, I think our, and part of it is just making folks more aware of the intersection of domestic violence and how often survivors are worried about their safety from guns. I'm not sure this is something that folks always think about when it comes to the issue of domestic violence. And for me, coming from the other side now, really looking at gun violence more intentionally, what I'm also finding is that the opposite is true, is that people don't realize how much domestic violence is intertwined with the issue of guns.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's in both directions. And that's why when we talk about the issue of gun violence, we talk about it in so many different forms, because it's such a complex issue. Holding on to that complexity and holding on to the nuances is something that I think we need to do much more work around, so that folks understand how intertwined those issues are.
I would also add, I think you're totally right. And I also think that because we live in, what is perceived as a fairly progressive state, that we have some of the strongest gun laws in the country, I think that it's easy for people to kind of assume that it's not the issue that it is. And I think that in many respects, I remember starting doing this work in 1995, and I felt like I was jumping up on my desk trying to get people to pay attention to, yes, this is happening right here, and I know that it's shocking, and yes, it is shocking. So I still think that that is still a little bit at play. And we do have, while we have really great legislators, there's also this little culture of this is the way we've always done it. And so it's not always easy to innovate if folks don't want to go there.
Great, thank you. We have another comment that if either of you want to speak to, it's not really a question, but I think it could have an interesting conversation. Acknowledging that what motivates the gun buying push is racism is key. This is a concerted national effort, while white supremacists worry about looting, and the byproduct is increased danger and risk for people experiencing domestic violence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's so much to unpack when we're talking about what is happening around the uptick of gun sales across the country. We could spend hours and hours just really analyzing what is going on with that and why that's happening, as well as the issue of this new culture that has been pushed on us, that safety equals having access to guns, and also safety from what, and how does race play into that conversation too. And absolutely a byproduct of that is that survivors of domestic violence are going to be made less safe, because more guns, as we talked about before, means escalated risk and more opportunity for harm, for lethality, for injury. And it is, I again could not agree with that more. It is all completely intertwined.
And I do think that there's an interesting similarity. Certainly, I'm sure the vast majority of gun owners are not domestic violence abusers, but there's some similarity. So in all honesty, I've never owned a gun. I shot one time when my dad was in the Marine Corps. But I always get the sense that people buy guns, if they're not buying it for sport, but they're doing it for protection, it's this kind of like, I'm protecting what is mine. And that's not dissimilar to how abusers think about their intimate partners, that you are mine and I can do what I want with you. And so that's not a perfect part of it, but that's kind of what I thought about when I heard the comment.
Yeah, thank you for these great questions and comments, everyone. Some more questions that we're getting are domestic violence support groups talking to victims about the ERPO process?
That's a really good question. I think yes, probably not as much as we need to. I think about, we try to talk to them about the variety, the myriad of strategies that we need to have, I hate to use a cliche, but I'm going to, in our toolbox, that it's not, we've always known that just the plain old restraining orders aren't good for everybody. They're going to put some people on greater risk. They're going to put they're going to make other people safer. The ERPO, I don't think domestic violence advocates have, I don't think they actually have a really good familiarity with what ERPOs mean, how they're different from regular protective orders. And I think that's some work that we still have yet to do.
And just so folks are aware, an ERPO is an extreme risk protection order. It was something that was passed in Massachusetts in 2018. And part of the work of the coalition that we're very focused on right now is raising awareness about the availability of ERPOs so that family members know about their existence, medical and mental health providers can counsel patients that they're working with around the availability of such orders, which temporarily remove access to guns when there's a concern about risk to self or others from a family member or a police officer or police department can apply for an ERPO. And so part of the work we are doing is to make sure that providers and the community as a whole really understands what an ERPO is and how to access it should they need it.
And that's so important because when you look at that commonality between domestic violence, homicides, murder, suicides, and mass killings, that these likely, there have been signs that people have seen and not noticed. But if people begin to understand the sorts of behaviors that they can pay attention to maybe suss out a dangerous situation, and if they know they have an access to guns, it could really be a powerful tool used with, many other tools at our fingertips.
Great. We're getting some more questions about restraining orders and domestic violence, some similar conversations. We're getting a question about, do domestic violence restraining orders require removing guns in Massachusetts?
Yes. I mean, if it's brought to their attention, a judge will have the guns removed. The trick is really about transferring that information from the victim or the advocate to the judge.
So a similar question about, what happens if someone who might have a domestic violence incident on their record from another state moves to Massachusetts. How would that work if they were trying to buy a gun? I don't know if either of you want to speak to that.
I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, I know that we're supposed to be able to share all of those records with each other, and that should be known. I also know that, the FBI is supposed to be one of the important groups that are doing these gun background checks. So, I mean, I would say yes, but I don't have any deep knowledge about that.
I would also share my experience working with survivors, that information sharing gets very tricky and doesn't always happen effectively. And so things can fall through the cracks because that information sharing is not happening. And that's not just across state lines. That can often be from county to county in Massachusetts as well. Yeah. So and it's a whole conversation unto itself around how we talk to each other around danger or some history that somebody might have with law enforcement or with domestic violence in the past. There are several models that are trying to address that and make sure that folks are doing a better job of information sharing so there's a comprehensive picture to really assess the level of danger of a particular offender and to make sure that different law enforcement entities are all working with the same information.
And you bring up a really good point because it's also about establishing a uniform way to describe things. So almost like a data dictionary. And so what, something may mean one thing in Massachusetts could it mean something completely different in, I was going to say New Hampshire, but it's probably less likely, but let's say Nevada.
On another similar note, how have the court processes like these been working during the pandemic in your experience? Are the courts open? Are people able to get restraining orders as they need them?
They are. So, there was, I think, for many of us, there were a couple days where everybody didn't know what was happening, but the courts are open for emergency restraining orders, for any kinds of hearings, not all hearings, but emergency kinds of hearings. And they're either coordinated through the court. I know that in Essex County, we have a helpline at each court, and I believe that's been rolled out statewide now, where folks can call the helpline and explain the situation and then get directed to how to get help.
So it is getting close. It is 8. So just to be respectful of folks' times, we have a few more questions that we are happy to stay and answer for a few more minutes, but understand that people might have to hop off the call now. We're getting another question about during the pandemic, when people are not maybe able to come into shelters, what is the best way for community groups to help?
So I'm imagining you're asking about people that aren't working at domestic violence or sexual assault organizations. So I think really the best way to help is to help support your local DV organizations. And the reason I say that, it's typically with some more resources for survivors. So here's what we know. Here's what we do. A survivor is contacting us because of coronavirus, because of the pandemic. There is some fear about going out in public, fear about getting coronavirus. They're also being told to go to the grocery store once a week or once every other week. And so many of the folks that we work with have real financial issues. And so typically we would give them a $50 or $100 gift card. That's not cutting it when their kids are no longer going to schools, getting school meals. Now all of a sudden everyone's at home. She's dealing with, possibly losing her job. So what we've been asking our community to do is help us get larger gift cards for folks so that they can really go and get what they need, whether it's gas, medical supplies, or groceries. The other thing, obviously, is if you are working in a community organization or a faith-based organization and you are in touch with people that you're worried about, please make sure they have the phone number for either SafeLink, which is a statewide hotline, or for the local domestic violence or sexual assault provider.
Great. Thank you so much. We are a little bit over our time. It's a little after 8 o'clock. So again, we want to be respectful of people's time. And it looks like we have gotten to all of our questions in the chat box. So thank you for all of those great questions. And on behalf of all of us at the Coalition, Suzanne, I want to thank you again for your time, for your expertise, for the work that you have done to enhance survivor safety, for the work that you will continue to do on behalf of survivors. The world is a safer and better place because of the work that you are doing. So thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight.
Well, thank you. I would say the exact same thing about the Mass Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. You guys are doing amazing work, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for being a part of this conversation. Again, it's been really meaningful for me to be able to talk about the intersection of domestic violence and gun violence. I'm really glad that we got a chance to hash through some of these issues. I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. And we will also be sending out information about our upcoming town halls in the very near future. So please look out for that information. So thanks to everyone. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care, and I hope you all stay healthy and safe and well.